The dollar has been the world's reserve currency for decades, but its history goes back centuries to before the United States was the United States. In a new book called The Almighty Dollar, 500 Years of the World's Most Powerful Money, Brennan Greeley chronicles the currency's history, explains its dominance in global finance, and looks ahead to the role it will play in a world in which cash may no longer be king.
Well, this week I sat down with Brendan and I started off by admitting my surprise that the dollar does in fact predate the U.S.
And when I started working on this book, I was going to start it in 1971 when Nixon, took the dollar off gold. And then, I ended up in 1776, and there's a challenge at 1776 with the dollar, which is that, we're taught to assume monetary sovereignty. We assume that a country has control over its money. And if that's true, then you get new country, new money. We declared political sovereignty in 1776, but we did not declare monetary sovereignty. We decided that our currency was going to be a big silver coin from the Spanish Empire with a German name. And so that makes this question of new country, new money a little bit problematic. And sort of trying to figure that one out, I found this whole other story that starts in a silver mine in Bohemia in 1520. And we can talk about silver mines. I can talk to you for a very long time about silver mines. But I think more importantly, we have to recognize that the United States did not create the dollar. Monetary sovereignty is won very slowly and with a lot of difficulty over time, and it's constantly being eroded at the edges. And so the story for me of the dollar and America is two separate things. There's an American story, there is a dollar story. America won control over the dollar and may be in danger of losing it now. The history of a currency is not the history of a country.
Let's talk about the uniqueness of the dollar, and you quote Robert Mundell, the economist, who says, effectively, all money sort of start domestic and some become international, they become global currencies. The dollar, as you point out, kind of subverts that paradigm. This is a global currency first.
See, this is what I love about David Gura. You read the book.
I read the book, yeah.
Aw. It's very hard to think of a currency as inherently global because our experience with currency is local. And then if we go abroad, maybe somebody else uses it. Robert Mundell, I'm going to take a huge risk here. I, in the book, disagree with a Nobel Prize winning. Yes, exactly. Robert Mundell has a Nobel. I do not. But he wrote that great currencies are the children of great empires. The problem with that is I don't see that with the dollar. So the original silver Joachimsthaler, so the word dollar comes from a valley in Bohemia that was settled by Saxon miners that produced silver. They made these big, very high quality silver coins that were not useful for sort of daily purchases, but were very useful for merchants in the Baltic. So those Joachimsthaler became known as taler, and then that's how we get the dollar in English. This system was already in place by Shakespeare, who mentions the dollar twice, once in the Scottish play, once in The Tempest. Okay. There was no empire pushing those coins out into the Baltic. There was no empire pushing those coins, through the Low Countries into England, where a groundling at the Globe Theatre would have known that a dollar was a big silver coin. Instead, they traveled because they were useful. Big coins worth about a week's labor, or I calculated 21 pounds of bacon at the time. And not really useful for daily purchases. They have a power on their own, and they were copied all over. So as soon as you get those taller, very quickly, within about 2 or 3 years, you start to get copies in northern German cities, copies in the Netherlands. And so this idea of a coin was inherently international from the start. And the Holy Roman Empire, neither Holy Roman nor an empire, but the Holy Roman Empire, which was sort of nominally in charge of that area at the time, for a lot of legal reasons, didn't like those silver dollars at all and resisted them as long as it could. Empire was actively fighting against this. But a certain kind of currency can be so useful to merchants and investors now and the wealthy that it has its own power and drags itself out of the world. It's not pushed by the empire.
And we hear over and over again that the dollar's supremacy is at risk at this political moment.
In any historical market that you look at, there were virtual promises and paper promises and silver and gold working together. Again, if we take the example of colonial America, a lot of commerce took place on the ledgers of shops. You would owe the shop money, and then you would come back and you would clear it, sometimes with money owed to another shop. Right? A lot of this money, they they were aware, and they used these words in colonial America, of real and imaginary money. That's not a value judgment. Imaginary money isn't bad. It just means it's credit held on the ledger of a shopkeeper, right? And that was every bit as useful to them as the very real money that they had in gold, and then sometimes in bills of credit issued by the colonial governments. Okay, so we have always had virtual money. You know, almost all of our money has been held on the balance sheet of a bank. This was true in the 19th century. This was true in the 20th century. So the fact that we're moving beyond this physical note is interesting, but I don't think it represents a fundamental change in what money is. When we look at the dollar system, I think it's important to point out that it's composed primarily internationally of deposits on offshore banks. The way we create dollars now, brand new dollars, is commercial banks, when they lend you money through a mortgage or credit card loan, they just mark up your account with brand new dollars. They don't get those dollars from the Fed. Nobody arrives with like a case of $100 bills to hand them to the bank to hand to you. This is it's accounting that the bank does on its own ledger. So when we look at the future of the dollar system, we have to see what protects those dollars. The Federal Reserve has made clear that it will offer short-term loans to foreign central banks to bail these dollars out in a crisis. They've done it twice, 2009, again in 2020. American banking regulation is, you know, you and I might have some issues with it, but it's pretty solid. We've had federal deposit insurance since the 1930s. No other country has this vast pool of insured deposits. Foreign governments come, or rather foreign investors come to rely on the reliability of domestic bank dollars in the United States. The third thing that holds the dollar up is the basic institutional strength of the United States. When we look at those three legs of the stool, the Fed, domestic regulation, and institutional strength, I don't think any of those is going away. None of those has disappeared. Offshore dollar deposits are still growing, but for the first time in our lifetimes, there's a question mark on each of them. There's a question mark on whether or not the Fed will, in fact, rescue foreign commercial banks and their dollars in a crisis this time around. There wasn't a question mark the last crisis. There's a question mark about American institutions. There are several question marks about American institutions. And there is a push within the Fed and within the federal government to loosen regulation on banks. We've already seen it with sort of the much lighter regulatory touch on stable coins, which are just a different form of dollar. So I don't think that stool is in danger of collapsing. But I do think that we're having this discussion, and that's slightly troubling that for the first time we're having this discussion. A year and a half ago, I don't think we'd be having this discussion.